Welcome back for another episode of Errant Adventures. As always, I'm your game master and solo player, Steve Morrison. On this week's episode, we return to Heartvale for another faction turn, covering the last week of the Crest journey to Davennar. Find out what happens on episode 50, Visions and Violence. As the drift ship Undanya approaches the city of Davennar, our view of that ship and that sea and the city of spines, the city that bleeds, fades out. We are drawn back across the sea to Heartvale as we begin another faction turn. It's been a week of travel for Ben, Arid, and the others as they made their way to Davennar. They've arrived in Davennar now, but we need to resolve what happened in the intervening week for the various factions. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to roll a d8 to get some initiatives for each of the factions, and then we will play out this turn. So for the Crest, I got an 8. For the Vedala, a 7. For the Shade, a 4. For the Drift, a 2. For the King's Word, a 5. And for Lord DeSoto, a 1. So we begin with the Crest. The Crest are going to, at the start of their turn, gain 3 treasure. And then their faction goal is to increase the Crest's numbers. We have 3 force assets, we have 1 cunning asset, and we have no wealth assets. We've got 3 treasure to play with. Can we spend that treasure to gain a new asset that is going to increase their numbers? Let's take a look and see if there are any wealth assets that would be useful to us for this venture. Looking at the 1 and 2 level wealth, there are a number of options here. There's armed guards, there's a cooperative business, there's farmers, front merchant, caravan, dragomans, pleaders, and a worker mob. I feel like a lot of those things having to do with like businesses and stuff like that are probably not going to be a good fit for the Crest because they are more mobile. So let's go back to cunning assets and see what we've got option-wise there. So we have a cunning of 3. So we've got informers, petty seers, smugglers, useful idiots, blackmail, dancing girls, hired friends, saboteurs, bewitching charmer, covert transport, occult infiltrators, and a spy master. I feel like a spy master could be interesting for the Crest, and also saboteurs could be interesting. So saboteurs, an asset that is attacked by the saboteurs, can't use any free action abilities it may have during the next turn, whether or not the attack was successful. I feel like the Crest would likely have saboteurs in their employ. Unfortunately, that would cost 5 treasure, and we only have 3 to play with. So I feel as though they probably can't do that this turn. You know, we could hire some smugglers. That might also be useful for the Crest to be able to get goods and wealth and stuff like that into the city without having to go past the sort of government oversight. So smugglers get, as a free action, once per faction turn, the smugglers can move any allied wealth or cunning asset in their same location to a destination within movement range, even if the destination wouldn't normally allow an unsubtle asset to locate there. So that's kind of cool. And it's only going to be 2 treasure to purchase. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I think I'm going to go ahead and for the Crest's turn, they are going to create an asset, and that is going to be smugglers. So we'll go ahead and spend our 2 treasure, which will reduce us down to 1 treasure remaining. And we can ask the question once again, have we increased the Crest's numbers? I feel as though the answer is more than likely. So I'm going to say it's very likely. And I think that we should pick our chaos factor here, because I don't know that it feels right for the chaos factor to be 8 like it was at the end of the last scene in the last episode. So I'm going to say the chaos factor is 6. I'm going to say it's very likely that we've successfully completed this goal. 16 is on a very likely, an exceptional yes. So very much so, the Crest has increased its numbers enough. So that is going to grant the Crest an experience. And I think what that tells us is that the Crest has returned to its, at least close to its numbers before the disaster in Larsha that they were fleeing, that they came to Heartvale and needed to recover. And so maybe we see this scene of Captain Netheridge, and he is sitting in the crow's nest. And I think we see Sallow sitting there, sort of newly promoted as the leader of these witch hunters. And I think that we should give a name to the smugglers, somebody who represents them. And I think to do that, I'm going to go to our Dice Geeks Great Book of Random Tables, and we're going to go ahead and roll up some names. And I think we're going to make the leader of the smugglers here a human male. So we'll do our human male names. I'm going to roll. 44, Trowbridge, Kine, or Alger. I like Alger. Actually, I like Alger Trowbridge. So I'm going to go with that. So Captain Netheridge is sitting at this table, and across from him are Laurie Sallow, Alger Trowbridge, who is maybe this little bit older man with sort of pitted skin and a gruff look, although there's kind of a gleam of humor in his eyes. And the captain is looking over at Trowbridge, and he says, Alger, glad you finally decided to come aboard. Alger sort of nods and says, happy to be here, Captain. I've heard a lot about the Crest, and after our, falling out with the City Watch, the fact that you were able to get us out of that bind, we appreciate it. Netheridge nods and says, you understand that having sworn service to the Crest, you will not undertake operations without my express permission. Trowbridge nods and says, I understand the deal, Captain, and I'm happy to comply. You got me and mine out of a potential life sentence. I'm happy to help you move whatever goods you need to. The captain nods and says, excellent. As Corporal Sallow here has completed her previous mission, you and she are going to be working together to smuggle some artifacts out of the city. Artifacts that can't fall into the wrong hands. Alger Trowbridge smiles and says, tell me where you need them to go, Captain, and I'll make sure they get there. And I think we fade out from that scene as the Crest have enough numbers to do what they need to, and now they have a group of smugglers. So from there, we can go ahead and move on to the Vedala family. Now, this is where I think things get interesting, because the Vedala family are going to gain 3 treasure, so that's going to take them up to 4 treasure. And then they are going to turn around and spend that treasure. Oh no, I just realized that they cannot do that this turn. What a terrible, terrible thing. In the faction turn, you can only have a number of assets equal to your score for each stat. So, for instance, the Vedala have a cunning of 3, and they have a covert transport, they have blackmail, and they have useful idiots. The petty seers are a cunning asset, so they could not purchase that asset without getting rid of one of the assets they currently possess. And there is a way to sell an asset where you basically get some treasure back. I think I'm going to rule that they can just get rid of an asset. They're not going to get anything back for it, but they're going to basically clear that space so that they can buy the Petty Seers this turn. So I'm going to get rid of this blackmail asset. And I think what that represents is, as things have progressed in Mudside, in the district of Davennar that they're in, where this temple is located, and this disease has sort of spread far and wide, I think it has made fewer and fewer of the sort of powerful elites look towards that district. They've maybe even blocked it off so people can't easily come and go from that district. And so I think those blackmail pieces that the Vedala have collected are not as effective or useful anymore. So we're just going to go ahead and get rid of that asset. And we're going to replace it with a group of petty seers. That is going to represent the Vedala basically either co-opting or corrupting some seers, some oracles, and they are going to bring them into the heart of their temple, where they have set up this arcane laboratory, and they're going to attempt to determine where Vargosh's resting place is, because they are looking for a specific item. So let's go ahead and take a moment here to roll on the fate chart. And I think we can go with that same sort of 6 chaos rank that I did before for the previous roll. And I'm going to say that with the Petty Seers and the Arcane Laboratory and all of these things that they've done, that it is very likely that they are going to be able to determine where this resting place is. And the thing that they're looking for is not necessarily like a grave, but they're looking for an artifact called the Dread Beetle's Quick. And it is, for all intents and purposes, the heart of Vargosh, this maybe well of power that is still connected to and powering the rest of these artifacts. And so I think we're going to say it's very likely. We're going to roll on our chaos rank of 6 on the fate chart. 42 is a yes. So they discover its resting place. So here's information that I know that these characters don't know, which is Vargosh was defeated in Othral by members of the Crest. But something else that I know that the characters don't know is that Lord Bacchio de Fara took an expedition to Othral and found an artifact of Vargosh. We've seen that artifact, the Eye of Vargosh. But did he bring other things back? Because this is very important. If he did, then it is possible that that artifact that they're searching for is in fact back in Heartvale. If not, then it's still buried in Othral. Did Lord Defara bring back more artifacts than just the Eye of Vargosh? I think it's 50-50. Here we go. 85 is a no. It's not. That means that it is still buried in Othrall, in that village that was beset by sickness, and that Defara did visit and that he was excavating parts of. Was he searching for this artifact specifically, or was he just, as nobles often do, searching for treasure in far-off lands? We may never know what Lord Defara's desires were. We only know what he did. He found something and he brought it back to Heartvale, and it corrupted him. And that small brush with the power of Vargosh gave him unholy strength and fury. Could that happen to someone else? Has that already happened to someone else? I don't know yet, but I think we may find out sooner rather than later. So I think we need to have a quick scene where we see the Vedala enacting this ritual. And I think that looks like this. Feet shuffle down stone steps as candlelight flickers against the walls, slick with condensation. A beautiful young woman leads the way down these steps, followed by a half-dozen hooded figures, as they emerge into a cavern. At the center of this cavern is a pool of brackish liquid, surrounded by arcane sigils carved into the stone floor. The figure of an old woman sits before the pool, staring into it with eyes that flash like agates. The young woman says, "Mother, I have brought the seers." "Good," she says, not taking her eyes from the pool. "Take your places." As if urged on by an unknown force, the hooded figures move to either side of the pool and kneel. The young woman takes her place across the pool from her mother. The old woman spreads her arms and says, "We must see far and wide. We must know where our master's vessel is hidden. Give your talent to this focus." The seers begin chanting, pouring their talent into the pool. The young woman joins them. The mother rises and extends her hands out over the pool. "Dread beetle, we seek your quick, that we may bathe in its power, and open the way for you to rise again. Guide our eyes to see, guide our thoughts to know. Show us where it is buried, that we may find it and enact the ritual." As if on command, the pool begins to swirl and churn. Black as ichor at first, it becomes clearer and clearer. The mother's eyes widen as she sees a banner flapping in the wind, a talon on a red field, surrounded by a golden crest. She hisses. Then she sees the village, a small place on a field of grass with a copse of trees nearby. There's a battle going on there, and those within the village carry the same signs of the Dark Master's presence as those on the streets outside this very temple. Then the vision changes. It's the same grassland, but the village is gone, mostly, though some ruins of buildings yet remain. The copse of trees has grown, encroaching on the ruins, and a group of riders pass by. She sees another banner, this time the royal symbol of Othrall, and she knows she has found it. After these many years, she knows where Vargosh's heart is buried. As we come back to our faction turn, The Vedala turn is over. They have bought their asset. They have discovered Vargosh's resting place. That is going to give us 2 experience, and we can clear their faction goal. Next, we're going to move to the Kingsword. Now, I had to choose a new faction goal for them because their goal was to establish a base of influence, which they did by buying a council seat on the Council of 12. So I chose a new goal, which is Sphere, Dominance, Wealth. And so for that, it is choose Wealth, Force, or Cunning. Destroy a number of rival assets of that kind equal to your score in that attribute. So let's go ahead and take a look at our map here. They're going to gain 5 treasure, and they are surrounded by other assets. They're surrounded by vigilant agents and the Shade Free Company, which is the Crest soldiers that are working directly for the Shade to hunt down this cultist of Vargosh inside of the Kingsword. They're also surrounded by the DeSoto armed guards. There are Crest and DeSoto in the South Scales, which is the next district over. And then there are Shade, Crest, and DeSoto over in Wolfsong. There's a bunch of different areas that they could move towards. But because they're seeking dominance in wealth, they need to destroy wealth assets. So the Crests don't have any wealth assets. The Drift have 1, the Shade have 2, and the Council of 12 in the form of Lord DeSoto have 2 as well. So right now, the Kingsword have Useful Idiots, they have their Trade Company, and they have their Pleaders. I think they might make an attack against the Free Company for the Shade, because those are a wealth asset and they are currently causing trouble for the Kingsword, even if the leadership of the Kingsword is not aware of their sort of main goal, which is to hunt down this cultist of Vargosh. You know, actually, I think we need to resolve something before that. And that is, last time we rolled on whether or not Ephron Felhart's lieutenant took control of the Kingsword, and we got to know that it was not the cultist, that last cultist of Vargosh, who took control of the Kingsword. But I think we should ask the question, is that individual trying to take control of the Kingsword? Because I feel as though this is going to go in a different direction depending on whether or not the Kingsword are being run by this cultist of Vargosh or by people who are not connected to the cult at all. So let's go ahead and say, is this individual, Ephron Felhart's lieutenant, planning to try and take over the Kingsword? I think it's a near sure thing. So let's go ahead and roll chaos rank of 6 on our fate chart. 49 is a yes. So he's definitely trying to take over the Kingsword. Has he been able to have the time and the resources to move into position to take control of the Kingsword? I think that is somewhat likely. 49 again, which is another yes. So he has the means, he has the opportunity. Is he successful? I think that it is 50-50. 67 is a no. No, he is not successful. So I think there is this attempted coup within the Kingsword. And this individual who served Ephron Felhart, who is a true believer in the cult, attempts to take over the Kingsword. But Mortar, I think, has prepared for this, and the fell swords that he has working for him are ready to stand up and fight back. And so when this coup happens, the cultist of Vargosh is surprised to find this resistance within his own organization. and is driven out. It's a normal day in the Kingsword headquarters, at least as normal a day as it has been for the last few months. Mortar leans against a wall and sucks on the pit of a peach he just finished eating. He's wondering if DeSoto's guards will return to cause more havoc. Maybe he should have fought back more, actually drawn blood. But no, it wouldn't have done any good. One doesn't bloody the nose of a noble unless one is prepared to burn everything to the ground. Maybe if the question of leadership wasn't still in the air, they could have marshaled a response. But the higher-ups are still sorting out what had become of Fellheart and whether or not it was true that he was part of some cursed cult that had crossed the Red Fox. For his part, Mortar believed it. Fellheart had always struck him as a bit of a zealot. But what could you expect from a Resdinian? They were all about their god or the cults that opposed him. Regardless, Mortar expected it would be better in the long run to not have Fellheart around. After the dust settled and business returned to normal, of course. The hairs on Mortar's neck stood up, and he glanced up from the tile he'd been inspecting. A handful of figures had just entered the building, and based on his finely tuned survival instinct, he expected it to be more members of DeSoto's guards. But they weren't. They were Kingsword. Mortar recognized Malik and his right hand Mila amongst a half-dozen others. He'd heard they were back from whatever mission they'd been on, so their presence shouldn't set him on edge. But there was something about the way their eyes darted around the headquarters. They were on alert. As they headed towards the stairs, Mortar pushed away from the wall and looked around. He saw one of the fell swords Linford had loaned him, so he crossed the distance between them and tapped the young woman's shoulder. "Grab anyone you can and follow me," he growled. She nodded and headed off to where her fellows should be working. Mortar started casually walking toward the stairs, keeping his expression neutral. If any of Malik's crew clocked him, they didn't show any sign. "Hey, Malik," Mortar said. "You got a minute?" Malik's eyes found his and narrowed. There was a brief flash of distrust and worry before the operative shook his head and said, "I'm busy, Mortar. Can it wait?" Technically, Mortar outranked him, but Malik was most often treated as an independent operative, running his own crew on longer-term missions away from headquarters. The old sergeant could have pushed, but he could feel the malice running off the other man. Whatever he was here to do, he wasn't going to let Mortar get in the way. Instead, he raised his hands and said, "Yeah, I can wait. Find me once you're done and we'll talk." Malik nodded once and then headed up the stairs. His crew followed, though Mila spared the old sergeant a look of undisguised rage. Mortar smiled at her. The sound of their footsteps was already fading when the fell swords ran into the room, concern on their faces. "I don't know what's happening," Mortar said, "but it's not good. Follow me." They hurried up the steps in pursuit, and as they neared the top floor, Mortar heard the sounds of fighting. He grimaced and drew the short sword on his hip. On the landing, Mortar found 2 dead Kingsword, guards protecting the executive suite. Malik and his crew were in the process of finishing off the others who hadn't been taken completely by surprise. Mila must have heard their footsteps behind her because she said, "Malik, behind us." Malik turned and saw Mortar, and a gleam filled his eyes. "Guess we're going to have that chat now." Mortar nodded. "Seems that way." "I don't recognize anyone with you. New recruits? You sure they're going to stay loyal to you now that the killing has started?" Malik asked. "Why are you doing this, Malik? What's your beef with leadership?" "Doesn't matter. I've got one old dog to kill. Then the Kingsword will serve me." Mortar laughed and said, "Let's get to it then." The fell swords spread out behind him and faced off against Malik's crew. Mortar adjusted the grip on his short sword and stepped toward Malik, who attacked with the speed of a younger man. Mortar parried the blow and returned it, but the other man danced away. Malik produced a dagger in his other hand and closed, stabbing once, twice, 3 times in quick succession, driving Mortar back towards the stairs. "You're too old and slow," Malik snarled. "Out with the old, in with the new." Mortar blocked him again and said, "You may not be as old as I am, but you're not fresh. I don't care what your game is, it stops here. No, Malik cried. Ephron's work must continue. The dread beetle will rise again. He unleashed another flurry of strikes, his dagger drawing blood at last. As Mortar stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, he laughed. That's what this is about? That cursed cult? Malik, I never thought highly of you, but this is ridiculous. You can't bring a dead god back. Malik stepped forward, eyes gleaming with victory and something deeper. Madness. You won't be alive to witness it. Mila tried calling out to him, but Malik did not hear her. He was too focused on his prey. Mortar smiled and said, You may be the better fighter than I, but you made a fatal mistake. You underestimated my companions. I didn't bring fresh recruits. I brought killers. Malik spared a glance over his shoulder. One of the fell swords was down and bleeding, but 3 of Malik's crew were also down. Mila was barely fending off 2 of the fell swords, while the others were harrying the 3 wounded Kingsword that remained. Mila shouted again, Malik, we've got to go! We can't win this! Mortar took the moment's distraction and lunged, but Malik was still faster and danced to the side, the blade slicing across his side rather than driving through his heart. He stumbled away and ran. Mila and the others retreated down the hall toward a window with the fell swords in pursuit. Mortar watched as the traders leapt out the window onto the adjoining roof. The fell swords hesitated, unsure of the terrain. Mortar called them back. Beside him, the door to the executive suite cracked open, and a frightened face peered out. Mortar, is everything all right? The trembling voice of Rothery, master of the treasury, almost made the old sergeant laugh. Instead, he turned to the man and said, Quite all right. I would say that was the last of Ephron Felhart's regime. We might want to put out word that Malik and his crew are persona non grata. Whatever you think is best, please see that it's done. The door closed again and the lock clicked. Now Mortar laughed and shook his head. As much as things change, they stay the same. And I think the last question I have for the fate chart in regards to this is, does he stay in the city or does he flee the city? And I think it's probably pretty likely that he's going to flee the city because Felhart is gone. I mean, locked away in the Von Tryken vault. And, you know, this person has probably spent the last week or 2 hunting for any news of Felhart. And maybe the only thing that this cultist has been able to turn up is that Felhart is in the hands of the Red Fox. And realizing that there's no way that they're going to recover Felhart from the Red Fox, I think it's very likely that they flee the city, that they just get out of there. I'm going to say it is very likely, so here we go. 23, which is a yes. So this lieutenant of Ephron Felhart, this cultist of Vargosh, reads the situation and realizes that he's not going to be able to take back control of the Kingsword. He's not going to be able to find Ephron Felhart. And so he flees the city. So with that in mind, I think the Kingsword are no longer tied up with the cult of Vargosh. So we don't have to worry about that specifically. But I think they are concerned about these mercenaries who are trying to cause trouble for them. And so I think the pleaders are going to try and basically get those Crest soldiers sanctioned. And this is... it can do a cunning versus wealth attack. So the way that this works is the cunning of the Kingsword versus the wealth of the Shade, not the Crest, because the Shade purchased this free company unit of the Crest. So the Kingsword are going to strike out with their cunning of 5. Roll my d10. That is going to be a 6, so that is 11. Which means that in order to defend against this, the Shade are going to have to roll an 8 or higher in order to stymie this attack. That's a 1, so the attack is successful. So the pleaders deal 2d4 points of damage. And our free company here, how many hit points do they have? Free company has 6 hit points. So there is a possibility that they get wiped out in this attack. And again, I don't think this is it's going to kill these soldiers of the Crest. It's more of that they're going to be stopped by the City Watch and basically told, like, hey, you can't operate around the Kingsword headquarters. Like, we've been told to warn you off from being around here. So we'll roll 2d4, see what happens. A 2 and a 1. So that deals 3 hit points worth of damage. So half the damage on these hired mercenaries. So I think what we see here is these Crest soldiers who are observing the Kingsword headquarters. And maybe there is a cafe or like an open stall where some merchant is selling bread and fruit. And there are a couple of Crest soldiers standing by this stall, and they each have like a half loaf of bread with butter and honey and maybe a small pile of grapes. And they're just sort of standing there eating these things and watching the headquarters across the street when a few members of the City Watch approach them. And I think there is this brief exchange where the watchers are like, all right, you need to move along. And the Crest soldiers are like, why? I mean, we're just standing here eating. What's the problem? And the watchers say, all right, come on. We've had some complaints about your presence here. Move along. And I think there's this back and forth. The end result is, because the Crest are not willingly moving along, the City Watch take them into custody and drag them downtown, if you will, to the stockade, and Captain Netheridge has to send somebody around to pay their bail, basically. The Kingsword are on their way to establishing their sphere dominance, but they have to destroy 6 wealth assets in order to accomplish that. So they have quite a ways to go, but they have struck a blow against the Shade and also against all of the factions in the city as they attempt to overwhelmingly establish that they have dominance of the marketplace in Heartvale. I think most importantly, though, is we have now finally answered the question of whether or not the Kingsword are consumed by this cult of Vargosh. And the answer now is no. Nope, the Kingsword is clean of that cult-like activity. Whether they're clean of other things is a question for the future. So that ends the Kingsword turn. We will turn to the Shade next. They're going to gain 3 coin, which will take them to 8, and then they're going to immediately spend one of those as upkeep because they do have that free company. Their goal is to root out the enemy. Destroy a base of influence of a rival faction in a specific location. Difficulty equal to half the average of the current ruling faction's force, cunning, or wealth rating round up. I think that relates to the Vedala, and that is going to be either the temple or the ship of the Vedala, the Tagaro. So they can't really work on that, but I think they can try to hunt down these cultists. And this is where we have this cultist who has fled from the Kingsword, and these Crest soldiers who are in their employ are pursuing them. And I think we can go ahead and make a couple rolls here. Are their petty seers able to detect these cultists who are trying to flee the city? I think it's 50-50. We'll just keep that chaos rank of 6. 35 is a yes. So they are successfully able to detect them. And they're going to send the free company after them. So I think this is going to represent moving the free company, and this will be the Shade's action for this turn, from the north scales to the south scales, and then their free movement as part of their special ability will be to move into Tamor's bones. And they are going to, I think at that point, they're hunting through the Tame, looking for these cultists who are trying to sneak out of the city on a ship. And I think maybe here is where we ask the fate chart, do these Crest soldiers catch the cultists before they escape? I think it is, I'm going to say it's unlikely, because I think these cultists have been hiding for a long time and they've been doing a pretty good job of it. So I'm going to say it's unlikely that they catch them, and we're going to roll on our chaos rank of 6. 26 is a yes. Yes, they do catch them. So I think we need to see that scene of them finding the cultists and hunting them down. Mila leaned out from the alley and studied the docks. It was night, but there was still City Watch patrolling. Not necessarily more than usual, but Malik had told her to be careful. She made her way across the open dock and found the ship. Slipping on board, she poked around. The crew were mostly out carousing, and those who remained behind were fast asleep, even the watchmen. She didn't think much of their security, but a quick search of the vessel indicated they were at least honest about their trade. It wasn't a trap as far as she could tell. She slipped back out and returned to their hideout. Malik looked relieved when he saw her, and she nodded. It looks good. He nodded, still favoring his side. Let's get ready to move. He wanted to be on board that ship before the rest of the crew returned. That was part of the deal with its captain, and he was eager to get out of the city. His attempt to wrest control of the Royal Dispatch Company from those mealy-mouthed merchants had failed, and they had not found Fellheart either. Mila knew he was a cultist. She didn't care. It really wasn't any of her business what he got up to. What mattered is that he helped her out of an unhappy life, and she owed her current success to him. She would follow Malik wherever he led. They gathered the others, injured as they were, and made their way onto the dock. They were most of the way there when Mila noticed a flash of movement on the far side of the main dock, jutting out into the harbor. A coral arced through the air and struck Ibra in the throat. He gurgled and fell. "Trap!" Malik cursed as figures emerged from a half-dozen hideouts. A short woman with hunched shoulders stepped forward, hands resting on the hilts of 2 daggers in her belt. She said, "Kingswood, we know who you are and what you're trying to do. You've got 2 options. Surrender and live, or die here on these planks." Mila could barely make out the badge on her cloak, a talon and crest, reflecting the firelight of the surrounding torches. She looked at Malik. "We can't win this fight. We're too injured and there's too many of them." "You're right," Malik said, "and you all should surrender to them. But I have no intention of being subjected to the indignities they intend for me. You've been a good crew." Mila grabbed his arm and said, "Boss, don't do this. Live to fight another day." He turned and grinned at her. "Though I go to my death now, when the corruption of Vargosh takes the world, I will rise, survive, and I will see you again." She saw the madness in his eyes, and she didn't believe his words. But when she looked over at those crests, she saw cold reality in their eyes. They didn't care if the Kingsword surrendered or fought. The conclusion was foregone. Mila smiled back at him. "Nah, I've got your back, boss." With an explosive cry, they drew their weapons and charged. A dozen crossbows thunked as quarrels littered their bodies. Malik and Mila stumbled and fell. The other Kingsword, who had no intention whatsoever of following Malik to a certain death, looked at the Crest soldier who surveyed the bodies. "What a shame," she said. Then her eyes flicked up to them. "Looks like you lot were the smarter ones. Throw down your weapons and come with us." There are some folks who'd like to ask you some questions. All right, so that is going to do it for the Shade. And next, we're going to move on to the Drift. So once again, I had to choose a faction goal for the Drift. Theirs is to expand their influence, so they need to plant another base of influence at a new location. So they're going to gain 4 treasure. That's going to take them up to 16 treasure. And they have their base of influence in the harbor. They have their base of influence, the shop in the South Scales. And then if we are looking at our group here, we have a Drift Worker mob in Tamor's Bones, and we have Drift Infantry in the South Scales. So I think the Drift are probably going to move to the North Scales now, and they're going to try and make some inroads and create a base of influence there. So again, my house rule of giving them a free move, I'm going to use that to move them into the North Scales, and then we're going to attempt to expand our influence as the action for this turn. So that is going to be establish a new base of operations in a location. Must have at least 1 asset there. Spend 1 treasure for each hit point the new base of influence is to have. And I think, looking at our treasure, we have 16 treasure. I think I can easily spend 10 here. So we're going to say the North Scales, 10 hit points. And in order to do this, the owner makes a cunning versus cunning attribute check against every other faction that has at least 1 asset in the same location. If the other faction wins the check, they are allowed to make an immediate attack against the new base of influence with whatever assets they have present in the location. So there are DeSoto armed guards, there's the Kingsword and the Shade, who are all located in this area. Now, oddly enough, I don't know that the Kingsword are all that interested in fighting against the Drift. So I'm going to say that they don't count for this. But the DeSoto are definitely opposed to the Drift gaining influence in the city. And I think the Shade, because of Lady Von Triken's attachment to the Council of 12 and sort of the power difference between the establishment of the city versus the more egalitarian setup of the Drift, means that the Shade are probably going to be opposed to this as well. So the Drift have to make a cunning versus cunning against both the Shade and Lord DeSoto. So the Drift have a cunning of 6. So that's pretty good for them. I'm going to roll a die here. 5 on the die, so that's going to be 11 total. The Shade have a cunning of 4, so they need to roll a 7 or higher to beat this. A 2, so they do not. And then our cunning versus the DeSoto. Rolled a 6 on the die, so that's 12 for the Drift. The Lord DeSoto has a cunning of 3, so he needs to roll a 9 or a 10 in order to have a say in this. A 6, so neither faction is able to fight against this base of influence being established. And so the Drift have now established another base of operations within the city. And they're creating this pipeline through the merchant district. Remember, the Drift are this collection of ships that are basically little democracies. And they have a constitution, and they're much more egalitarian than the city of Heartvale itself. And so they're often hired by merchants of Heartvale as escorts because they are a little bit more, not necessarily reliable than like hiring a Heartvale naval ship or like petitioning the government for a ship to defend a merchant transport, but they are more likely to be steadfast defenders of a merchant vessel because they have a stake in every operation that they embark on. So I think what this is, we haven't really established what the shop in the South Scales is, but I think the North Scales is, you know, even more sort of entrenched mercantile setting. So I think they're probably trying to establish either another shop or like a front, or maybe even trying to like make inroads with some of the guild halls in that area to gain exclusive contracts, maybe with like the carpenters or like all of these different small f factions rather than capital F factions that are in the North Scales. And so seemingly they are making progress on that. And I think we can go ahead and end their turn there, but they successfully did that. So they're going to gain 3 experience because it was a difficulty of 1 plus 1 if a rival contests it. There were 2 rivals who contested it, so I think that'll make it 3 experience, which they can add to their 2 already for a total of 5. We may even get to spend some experience soon. So we've got 1 faction remaining, and that is the Council of 12. This is going to be, I think, super easy. I chose for their faction goal the Wealth of Kingdoms, because I don't know that they are currently actively opposed to any faction other than maybe the Drift. And so I think once I complete this Wealth of Kingdoms, I'm going to probably have to create a faction goal about destroying one of these bases of influence from the Drift to try and cut down on some of this influence that they have gained. But for now, we can just look at this and it says that the faction has to spend treasure equal to 4 times the faction's wealth rating on bribes and influence. This money is effectively lost, but the goal is then considered accomplished. Faction's wealth rating must increase before this goal can be selected again. It's a difficulty of 2. So first of all, they gain 5 treasure, which takes their wealth to 35. Now that's a lot of treasure. And I've already talked about how I messed up the treasure rules for the first several turns. So they kind of have gained an inflated number of treasures, and everybody was also working under the same rules. So it kind of evens out. But I'm going to spend all of that treasure right now, at least 24 of it, because the Lord DeSoto has a wealth rating of 6 in order to fulfill this goal. So that will leave them with 11 treasure, but we're going to clear that out. And this just represents Lord DeSoto watching the influence of the Drift growing and is understanding that if he doesn't do something, the influence that they're gaining could threaten the structure of Heartvale. And so I think he is going to try and spread around some wealth, and especially with the merchants and some of the other sort of business owners in the scales, both north and south, try to turn them away from the Drift. Now, that's not going to have any necessarily mechanical impacts, but I think the next goal that they're going to have is going to be to attempt to destroy a base of influence. So I think maybe there's this scene of the sickly old Lord DeSoto, who is very much in his twilight years. He's looking out over the city from his estate in the Howl. And I think he is sort of even more tired and sickly than usual. And maybe his major domo is in the office with him. And Lord DeSoto turns to him and says, "Henrik, tell me, when I'm gone, what becomes of all of this? I have no heir to follow me. My nephew, Bacchio, is dead. My own son is less than useful. There is no one to take up my causes. There's no one to arise and stand. What becomes of all this?" And the major domo, Henrik, says, "My lord, there is still time to accomplish the things that you wish to. You can make a legacy of your actions. Already you have done so with the peace with Davennar. Such a thing I did not think possible. And yet you made it happen. What more could you accomplish if you set your mind to it? I think Lord de Soto waves a hand and says, "Do not speak to me of that peace. It was a necessary thing. I ask not what will people remember me for, but who will keep this city safe? Who will continue to let it grow and be strong? There are many on the council who have their own agendas. I fear for the city. I fear for the future. I can see the drift clawing its way into power. Their ideas are dangerous, Henrik. They have infected us already. That so much of our control over who rules the city has been whittled away by votes, by popular support. You know I would never speak ill of my old friend, Dux Lenton. But he is not the one that the council would have chosen when the seat came open. His popularity is what sealed his rise to power. And I fear that could happen again. And what if the person who rises to power is not as kind and honorable as he? We have seen it already in our history, Henrik. I do not wish to see it for our future. The drift must be just that. Set adrift. It is my goal before I die to see their grasp on our city broken. Henrik, who I think has been with Lord de Soto for a long time, nods and says, "And I believe you will see it done, my lord. Now come. I have some papers for you to look over and sign." And I think we fade out, and as we do, we end this faction turn, as now the Crest have arrived in Davennar, and it is time, next time, to engage in the hunt for the cult of Vargosh in earnest. Thanks for listening to Errant Adventures, and thank you so much to Syrinscape for the lovely ambient sounds and music throughout the episode. If you enjoyed the show, please tell anyone and everyone in your life about it. And if you want to support the show directly, leave me a review or buy me a coffee at coffee.com/errantadventures. That's ko-fi.com/errantadventures. If you want to interact with me, my handle on Instagram and Twitter is @errantsolopod, or you can email me at errantsolopod@gmail.com. I also post short fiction and campaign-related materials on my website, errantadventurespod.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.